So, both of the readings for this week, the Ristjord and Becker readings, address thick description and its role specifically in qualitative research. But before we get to that concept and what it looks like, it's helpful to think about what um, the opposite would be, right? Or the negative case, thin description. So, thin description is most associated with survey research, quantitative research, and the practices that strive for standardized and uniform measurement of observations. So, in the right hand corner of this slide, here is a very common survey question that probably every one of you have seen multiple times in your life. And the reason I want to emphasize it is that whether somebody is filling the form out, right, whether you are filling it out for something or a researcher has a standardized form that they are filling out as they make observations, that there are limited options, right? And so we see in both versions of this question, what is your gender for question one, or are you dot dot dot, that there are only two options, male and female. However, we know that many people do not identify with those categories. And there's also a whole entirely different discussion whether or not these questions are adequately measuring what they intend to measure because excuse me, the categories of male and female are in fact categories that refer to sex categories, which has to do with our biology and physiology. And we know that gender can be categorized and exhibited and manifested in many different ways, right? And so this is, however, the approach that quantitative researchers take. And the appeal of it is that it's standardized and it's uniform, and it's a lot more efficient and quick to collect lots and lots of observations in order to conduct statistical analysis, right? So that is absolutely an important thing to consider when we think about, well, why would somebody take this approach as opposed to another one? Um, and so, an example, a more descriptive example that would still qualify as a thin description is, say you're out in the courtyard of our campus at West Oahu and you note on your clipboard a woman is walking, right? So that would be an example of a thin description. It doesn't have a lot of detail. We don't know much about this person other than the gender that the researcher has identified and that they're walking, right? But as the readings highlight, thin descriptions leave out a lot of information about other relationships to motivations, goals, values, and norms that may be important to the event that you're observing and also to your research question. And so this is also related to the last point on this slide, that the limitations of a thin description is that it misses out a lot of detail that can help explain behavior or help explain the context within which you are observing a behavior, but it's also more susceptible to measuring extraneous variables. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the quantitative research methods part of the summer session. Okay, so moving on to the concept of interest in this lecture, and that is of thick description. So this is a concept that was coined by Clifford Geertz in a writing from 1974. He was an anthropologist. And thick description refers to the type of reporting, the type of research practice that captures observations in a manner that highlights these varied relationships between the actor and the event. So this could reflect the actor or the individual's motivations, their goals, the meanings of what they're doing, um, including important symbolism, norms, and values that are specific to that culture, right? Or to that space where the researcher is reporting from. So, an example of this, and this was also highlighted in the chapter 3 reading for this week, that would be a thick description compared to the one on the last slide where it just said a woman is walking, would be Dr. Mota-Back is hurrying across campus towards the library. So, at first glance, this statement may not seem very impressive, right? If this was something that you're reading from a fellow researcher on campus in your class. However, when we compare this description to the one on the previous slide with just a woman is walking, there's a lot of detail captured in here. It identifies the person, right, which indicates a degree of familiarity with not just that individual, but the space and the organization of our campus. The verb hurrying is significant detail. And you might be thinking, well, how would you know that someone is hurrying? But this is typically something that we can recognize without even realizing it through various things that we have just picked up throughout our socialization from the societies that we are a part of and that we grow up in. So things like walking quickly, right? Maybe a facial expression can show somebody is kind of stressed or concerned. Um, and those are just a few of the gestures that we associate with being in a hurry, right? Or running late or needing to get somewhere quickly, right? And it's also talking about a specific location and direction, right? So it's not just walking, it's across campus towards the library. So this statement, in fact, captures a lot of detail that we would consider a thick description. And in order to make these types of descriptions a thick description, Gertz and the others who have taken up this type of research practice argue that in order to do this, a researcher needs to immerse themselves within the community or the group or the culture that they're a part of for a significant period of time, right? So this goes well beyond administering a survey where you might just show up to a certain location or with a group of people, give the survey, and then leave, and the entire endeavor could take an hour or less, right? But the types of research methods that are most associated with thick description are qualitative methods, and specifically that of ethnography and participant observation. So we're going to talk more about those methods in the coming week when we delve more into qualitative methods and quantitative methods. But this is something for you all to consider as we think about the readings for this week and the discussion post question, but also as you start to think about your final assignment and your hypothetical research plan. So another way to link up this term thick description is to think about it with the previous lecture, the naturalism and interpretivism. So thick description is a hallmark of interpretivism. It fits squarely within that framework and research practice. Whereas a thin description or a more standardized, uniform, even numerical type of description from observations would fit in with the naturalism approach to social science research.